In a crowded courtroom, police suddenly grabbed a black attorney, dragging her out as shocked eyes followed. No one knew. She was about to return as the federal judge. The room was alive with murmurs, the kind of hushed energy that only exists in a courtroom just moments before a high-stakes case begins. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted in their seats, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the lawyers and defendants at the front. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting sharp lines of light across polished floors. Every sound, every whisper, seemed amplified by the weight of anticipation. Amid that charged silence, she entered. A young black attorney, her stride measured, her suit pressed to perfection. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the room as though she already knew its rhythm, its secrets. But from the moment she stepped inside, she could feel the stares. Not the admiring kind, not the curious kind. Stares laced with suspicion. Two officers standing near the door exchanged a look. One leaned slightly toward the other and muttered, "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The words weren't meant for her ears, but she heard them anyway, and she kept walking. She took her seat near the front, her notepad resting neatly in her lap. She was here to observe, to watch every detail of this case unfold. But as she sat, she could feel the temperature of the room shift. Eyes burned into her back. Conversation stopped the moment she turned her head, and when she looked up, she caught one of the bailiffs glaring at her, as if daring her to explain why she was here at all. The judge hadn't yet arrived. The attorneys shuffled their papers, but instead of focusing on the trial, the courtroom had fixated on her. Her skin, her presence, her audacity to exist in a place where others thought she didn't belong. She kept her composure, her chin lifted, her breath steady. She had been here before, in classrooms, in firms, in boardrooms where people asked her if she was lost before realizing she was the one leading the meeting. This wasn't new, but that didn't mean it stung any less. Behind her, a man whispered too loudly, "Is she even licensed to practice?" Another voice responded, "Probably someone's assistant trying to sit up front." The words floated forward, hitting her like tiny, deliberate cuts. She gripped her pen a little tighter. She wasn't here to prove herself. She wasn't here to justify her existence. But the weight of their doubt pressed against her like a suffocating blanket. One of the officers began moving closer. His heavy boots echoed against the wooden floor, each step drawing the attention of more people in the room. The murmurs grew quieter, anticipation shifting into something colder, sharper. The officer's partner followed, and together they loomed at the edge of her bench. "Ma'am," the first officer said, his voice low but firm, "this section is reserved for attorneys and officials only." She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze with calm clarity. "I am an attorney," she replied, her voice steady. But instead of retreating, he smirked, as if she had confirmed his suspicion that she was lying. The second officer crossed his arms. "Do you have proof of that?" The question cut through the silence like a blade. All at once, the entire courtroom leaned in, as if this quiet exchange had become more compelling than the case they'd come to witness. Her lips pressed together, her eyes unwavering. She knew what this was, an interrogation disguised as protocol, fueled not by procedure, but by prejudice. She reached into her bag, her movements deliberate, unhurried, though her heart thudded in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity as the officers loomed closer. For a moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a stage for humiliation. And though she produced her identification, though her credentials were in perfect order, she could see it in their eyes. This wasn't over. Because to them, it wasn't about paperwork. It was about the fact that she was here at all. The tension in the room thickened, pulling everyone deeper into the spectacle. Whispers grew again, louder this time, as though the crowd sensed what was coming next. And as the officers exchanged another look, one hand inching toward her armrest, The young attorney realized that this was not simply a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would strip her of dignity, only to set the stage for the moment that would redefine the courtroom forever. And that moment was about to begin. The officer's shadow stretched across her bench before his hand even moved. His voice came again, louder this time, carrying authority that demanded everyone's attention. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stand up." Every head in the courtroom turned toward them. The case hadn't even begun, yet here was the first drama of the day, and it wasn't about the defendant. It was about her. The young attorney looked up calmly, her posture unshaken. "I told you already," she said, her voice even, almost too controlled. "I am here in my professional capacity. I have every right to be seated." But her words rolled off him like water against stone. The second officer stepped closer, his stance wider, his chin tilted in superiority. "Let me make this clear," he said, his tone sharp. "If you don't comply, we'll have to escort you out. This is not open seating." Gasps rippled through the benches, yet not one person spoke up. Not one voice intervened. People simply watched, eyes wide, hands clutching their bags, as though witnessing a spectacle they secretly didn't want to stop. The attorney drew a slow breath. She reached into her bag, lifted her bar card, and held it out for them to see. "Here," she said softly yet firmly, "my credentials, my license, proof that I belong here." The first officer barely glanced at it. He smirked. "Anyone can carry a card. Doesn't mean it's real." The dismissal hit harder than the words themselves. To him, her proof was nothing. To him, her existence was still up for debate. She straightened, refusing to let anger shape her face. "Are you suggesting," she asked carefully, her tone measured, "that my documentation is fraudulent?" The officer leaned closer, his voice dropping low, though loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm suggesting you're trying to sit in a place you don't belong, and that makes this trespassing." The word trespassing dropped like a stone in the room. The weight of it made people whisper again, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some craned their necks to catch every word. Others shook their heads slowly, unwilling to intervene, but eager to judge. The attorney's grip tightened on her notepad. Inside, the sting of humiliation clawed at her. She had worked for years, through long nights, through prejudice, through the constant need to prove herself, and yet here she was, accused of trespassing in the very house of justice she had dedicated her life to serve. Still, she didn't break. "Officer," she said, her tone calm but unyielding, "you are mistaken. I have every legal right to be here. If you persist, you will regret this action." For a moment, silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then the second officer chuckled darkly. "Is that a threat?" It wasn't a question. It was a trap. His words were designed to twist hers, to make her seem combative, unreasonable. And judging by the growing smirks and whispers in the crowd, it was working. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. "No," she said quietly. "That is a promise." The first officer's patience snapped. He reached for her arm. "Enough. You're coming with us." Gasps erupted. A woman in the back covered her mouth. A man near the front shifted uncomfortably, as though he wanted to intervene but couldn't. The attorney rose slowly, her dignity intact even as the officer's grip tightened. Her eyes swept the room one last time. Every face stared back at her, some with pity, some with quiet satisfaction, most with silence. Silence that screamed louder than any insult. And in that silence, one truth echoed inside her. This wasn't just about her seat. This was about something much deeper, something they would all realize soon enough. As the officers prepared to drag her out, she lifted her chin, her voice steady, resolute. "You're making a mistake." And with that, the confrontation escalated into the moment that would shock every single person in that courtroom. The humiliation was only beginning. The worst was still to come. The grip on her arm tightened. The officer didn't wait for another word. With one swift tug, he pulled her from the bench, her notepad tumbling to the floor with a hollow slap that echoed louder than it should have. The courtroom froze, then erupted into whispers. "Is she under arrest?" someone muttered. Another voice. "What did she even do?" But no one stood. No one spoke for her. They simply watched. The attorney tried to steady her footing as the second officer moved behind her, pressing a hand against her shoulder. Her voice cut through the commotion, calm but strained with the effort of restraint. "I told you, I am an attorney. I have every right to be here. You're violating my rights." The first officer scoffed. "Save it. You can explain yourself outside." And just like that, they began to walk her through the courtroom aisle. Or rather, drag her. Every step was a parade of humiliation. Her heels scraped the wooden floor as she fought to keep her balance, her suit jacket tugged awkwardly by their rough hands. She held her head high, refusing to let tears betray her, but inside, her chest burned with a mixture of rage and helplessness. Onlookers leaned away as she passed, as if proximity to her might taint them. Some shook their heads in pity, others whispered, with a cruel kind of satisfaction. A few even pulled out their phones, capturing the moment as though it were entertainment. Her dignity was unraveling, thread by thread, in front of an audience too afraid or too complicit to intervene. "Keep moving," the officer growled, his hand now pressing against her wrist. Her voice cracked slightly as she resisted. This is unlawful. You're assaulting an officer of the court." The second officer snorted. "Lady, you're no officer of this court." The words stung, not because they were true, but because everyone around her believed them. The heavy double doors loomed ahead. The sound of them creaking open was deafening, and as they shoved her into the hallway, the once private humiliation became a public spectacle. The corridor stretched wide, filled with journalists, clerks and bystanders waiting for updates on the case. The moment they saw her forced out between two uniformed officers, a wave of murmurs crashed against the walls. Cameras flashed. Pens scratched against notepads. "What did she do?" someone called out. "Fraud? Disruption?" another guessed. "No," a third whispered. "They said she was trespassing." The attorney's heart sank. Trespassing. That single word could stain her reputation beyond repair. In seconds, the years she had spent building credibility, respect, and authority were being dismantled before her eyes. Still, she refused to let her voice break. She straightened her back even as the officers tightened their grip. "You will regret this," she said, low but certain. The first officer sneered, leaning close enough that only she could hear. "Not today, lady." They shoved her against the wall, patting her down as if she were a criminal. Gasps echoed around them. A young clerk covered her mouth in shock, but again, no one stepped forward. Every humiliation was deliberate, every action meant to remind her, "You don't belong here." And yet, even in the heat of disgrace, she clung to her composure, because she knew what they didn't. She knew the truth that would soon shatter their arrogance. Her reputation wasn't destroyed, it was merely waiting for its moment to rise. But for now, the crowd saw only one thing: a black woman, treated like a trespasser in the very halls of justice she was meant to lead. The officers tightened their hold, ready to haul her further down the corridor. But before they could take another step, she turned her head, her voice steady, unbroken. "This courtroom will remember what you've done." And with those words, she was forced deeper into the hallway, her humiliation complete, her resolve unshaken, and the stage set for a revelation no one was prepared to face. The hallway felt colder than the courtroom. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her away from the echo of whispers and gasps. And for the first time since the confrontation began, silence wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud. She leaned back against the wall, the sting of their hands still burning on her arms. Her chest rose and fell in sharp breaths, but her face remained composed, because that was all she had left. Composure, dignity, the fragile armor she had carried through a lifetime of moments just like this one. Her eyes drifted downward, catching her own reflection in the polished marble floor. And that's when the weight of memory struck. She was no longer in the courthouse. She was 12 again. Standing in a classroom, holding the top score in her hand, only to hear a teacher murmur, "She must have cheated." The disbelief that brilliance could come from her. Then she was 20, sitting in a law lecture hall, surrounded by peers who turned in their seats and asked, "So, who paid your tuition?" As though her presence there was a favor, not a victory earned through grit and sacrifice. The images collided, fast, sharp, relentless. Partners ignoring her voice in meetings, clients asking for the real lawyer, security guards stopping her aside at the doors of her own office. Every slight, every suspicion, every dismissal she had swallowed down for years came roaring back in that single moment in the corridor. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "How many times do I have to prove I belong?" Her throat tightened, but she refused to let a single tear fall. Tears were what they expected. Tears were what would validate their belief that she was fragile, unfit, too emotional to hold power. No, she would not give them that. And yet, as she stood there, the silence of the hallway pressed against her chest like a weight too heavy to carry. The sting of humiliation wasn't just about being dragged out. It was about the crowd. The silence of dozens of people who saw, who knew, and who chose to let it happen. That silence hurt more than the grip of the officers. For a moment she allowed herself to feel it all. The pain, the fury, the exhaustion of a life lived under suspicion. But beneath the ache, something else stirred. A fire she thought had long burned low. Because humiliation could do one of two things: break you or sharpen you. She straightened, brushing invisible dust from her jacket. Her reflection in the marble floor looked different now. Not a victim, but a woman coiled like a spring, moments away from reclaiming everything they had tried to strip from her. Her mind returned to the present. The officers thought they had finished the job. The onlookers thought they had seen her defeated. But the truth was far more dangerous than any of them imagined. She wasn't done. She never was. And as her heels clicked against the marble, each step deliberate, steady, unbroken, she carried one thought like a weapon. They will all know exactly who I am. With that, she turned back toward the courtroom doors, ready to face the very people who had written her off. Because the silence of humiliation was ending. The roar of revelation was about to begin. The hallway was no longer silent. By the time the officers forced her toward the far end of the corridor, a crowd had already begun to swell. Reporters who had been waiting for a headline smelled scandal before the ink was dry. Lawyers and clerks leaned out of doorways, whispering to each other with wide eyes. Witnesses who had come for the trial now turned their attention to a different spectacle: the public unmaking of a woman they had barely noticed before. "Did you see what happened inside?" one voice hissed. "I heard she tried to sneak into the attorney's section," another replied. "Unbelievable," someone else muttered. "What did she think she was doing?" The rumors spread like wildfire, each one bigger and crueler than the last. With every whispered word, her reputation shrank in their eyes. Some pitied her, shaking their heads as though she had brought this humiliation upon herself. Others smirked, enjoying the downfall they thought they were watching. And yet, no one spoke in her defense. The officers, fueled by the crowd's silence, grew bolder. One of them tugged her arm again, forcing her closer to the wall. "We'll process her down the hall," he muttered. "Shouldn't take long." Process her? The phrase wasn't meant for her, but it lingered in the air, heavy and demeaning. They spoke of her not as an attorney, not even as a person, but as paperwork, as a case file waiting to be stamped and discarded. A reporter shoved a microphone forward, his voice sharp. "Miss, do you have anything to say about the charges?" Her lips pressed together. She refused to answer, not yet. Her silence made the crowd restless, their whispers louder. To them, silence was an admission. Silence meant guilt. Behind her, two paralegals clutched folders against their chests, whispering so quietly it was almost a secret. "She looked so professional," one said. "I thought she was the rat. Eel deal." The other shook her head. "Guess not." The attorney's jaw tightened, but she never broke posture. Every inch of her wanted to scream the truth, to crush the rumors under the weight of her authority. But she didn't. Not yet. Because timing mattered. And when the truth came, it would not whisper. It would thunder. For now, she let them believe what they wanted. Let them write her downfall in their minds. Because the deeper they pushed her down, the greater the shock when she rose. The officers smirked, convinced they had already won, convinced they had reduced her to nothing more than a trespasser, a name whispered in the margins of tomorrow's headlines. What they didn't know was that this moment, their victory lap, was nothing more than the calm before the storm, because the woman they thought they had processed out of existence was about to walk back into that courtroom and change everything. The doors of the courtroom loomed before her like a challenge. Just minutes ago, those same doors had swung open to spit her out in disgrace. Now they stood as the gateway to her redemption. She paused, straightened her suit jacket, brushed an invisible crease from her sleeve. Every gesture deliberate, calm, precise, as if she were resetting the stage for the performance about to unfold. Inside, the trial was moments from resuming. The hum of voices carried through the crack of the door. They thought she was gone. They thought her story had ended in the hallway. But she knew the truth. The story was only beginning. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she pushed the door open. The courtroom fell silent. Every head turned. Every whisper died. There she was, the woman they had seen dragged out, the woman they had pitied, mocked and dismissed, walking back in with the poise of someone untouched by shame. The officers were the first to react. "Hey!" One by her, arced, moving forward to block her. His hand rose, ready to shove her back out. "You can't come in here!" But she didn't flinch, didn't break stride. Her hand slipped into her jacket, and when it emerged, it carried not a weapon of force, but a weapon of truth, a leather-bound case file, and a badge that glinted in the courtroom light. She held them high, her voice carrying clear and steady. "You don't tell me where I can or cannot be, because this is my courtroom." Gasps ripped through the room, a collective intake of breath as realization began to bloom. The officers froze. The arrogance drained from their faces as their eyes darted between her badge, the seal of federal authority stamped in gold, and the courtroom itself. She stepped past them as if they were nothing more than furniture in her way. Her footsteps echoed with the weight of command. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few lowered their eyes, ashamed of their silence earlier. The crowd murmured, voices overlapping in disbelief. "She's..." The judge? No. No, that can't be. Wait. Oh my God, it's her. She's the presiding judge. The presiding clerk, pale and wide-eyed, scrambled to confirm, rifling through paperwork until the truth sat plainly before him. Her name, stamped boldly at the top of the docket. The humiliation of minutes ago transformed in an instant into awe. The very woman they had written off as an intruder now stood revealed as the highest authority in the room. She approached the bench, her presence commanding silence without even needing to raise her voice. Her words came slow, deliberate, sharpened by the storm she had endured. "You dragged me from this courtroom. You called me a trespasser. You thought my credentials were lies." She let her gaze sweep across the officers, the lawyers, the gallery. "But the only lie here was the assumption that I did not belong." The room sat frozen in shame. Even the air seemed to hold still, afraid to move. With calm grace, she set her file on the bench and took her rightful seat. The gavel, polished and waiting, rested in her hand like an old friend. The power shift was complete. The spectacle of her removal had been rewritten into a moment of authority so absolute that no one dared breathe out of turn. The officers who had mocked her now stood trembling at the edge of the room, their confidence shattered. The crowd that had whispered against her now sat stunned, some averting their gaze in guilt, others unable to look away. She raised her chin, her voice ringing out, firm and unshakable. "This court is now in session." And in that single declaration, the entire narrative flipped. From victim to victor, from trespasser to judge, from silence to absolute command. The room buzzed with electricity, the truth striking everyone like lightning. And as the trial began anew, one thing was certain: nothing in that courtroom would ever be the same again. The gavel had not even touched the bench before the ripple began. A collective gasp swelled through the chamber, rolling like a wave across rows of attorneys, reporters, and onlookers. It was the sound of realization, the sharp sting of truth breaking through arrogance. Moments earlier, this same room had buzzed with judgment against her. Now, no one dared move too quickly, afraid of how the new balance of power might land. The officers were the first to crack. Their faces, once hardened with smug defiance, now blanched with fear. The one who had grabbed her arm earlier swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a man caught mid-confession. He stammered, voice low, "Your Honor, we didn't know." Her gaze cut to him like a blade, calm, controlled, deadly precise. "You didn't ask. You assumed." He dropped his eyes to the floor, his authority crumbling into dust. Across the courtroom, attorneys scrambled to realign themselves. The same lawyers who had smirked during her removal now leaned forward with forced respect, nodding eagerly, their eyes begging forgiveness they didn't deserve. One even whispered, barely audible, "She was right all along," but it was too late. Their silence earlier had betrayed them, and she remembered every face that had looked away when she was dragged out. The crowd, ordinary citizens, journalists, witnesses, shifted uneasily. Some leaned toward each other, whispering in frantic disbelief. Others sat frozen, eyes wide, as though they had witnessed something biblical. The transformation had been too sudden to process. One moment a humiliated lawyer, the next the highest seat of power in the room. Every gesture she made now carried weight. The way she rested her hand on the bench, the stillness in her posture, the deliberate control of her breath. She didn't need to raise her voice. The silence obeyed her without command. One of the officers, still trembling, dared to step forward. "Your Honor, what do you want us to do?" She turned slowly, her tone even but unyielding. "What I want," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to sink in, "is for this court to proceed with the dignity it was denied today." The officer nodded quickly, retreating like a child caught stealing. The weight of humiliation shifted in the room. It no longer rested on her shoulders. It clung to those who had doubted her, those who had judged too quickly, those who had seen her as less. She allowed the silence to linger. Let them sit in it. Let them feel what it was like to be powerless under the eyes of authority. Then, with a calm breath, she turned her focus to the case itself. Her words cut through the tension like glass. This trial is not about me. It is about justice, and I will see that justice is served. The words carried more than promise. They carried warning. Everyone knew from that moment forward that the courtroom was no longer the same place it had been minutes before. The walls themselves seemed to stand taller, straighter, as though honoring her rightful return. And as the first witness was called, the crowd leaned forward in anticipation. The trial was beginning anew, but this time, under her watchful eye, every lie would tremble and every truth would rise. The story had turned. The victim had vanished. Authority had reclaimed its throne. And as silence settled once again, all knew. The reckoning was only just beginning. The courtroom was silent, yet the silence carried weight, like the air before a thunderstorm. All eyes were locked on her. The woman they had dismissed, humiliated, and dragged out moments ago, now stood taller than anyone else in the room. She adjusted the papers before her, not out of need but as a deliberate gesture. The sound of the crisp shuffle echoed, commanding attention. Then her voice filled the chamber. This court does not bend to arrogance. It does not bow to prejudice. Justice stands above all of us, and today it will not be mocked. Every syllable landed like a gavel strike. Heads lowered, shoulders sank. The same officers who once pulled her by the arms now avoided her gaze, shifting uncomfortably as though the walls themselves judged them. "Bailiff," she said calmly, never raising her voice, "escort these officers out of the courtroom. They will answer for their actions elsewhere. Here, their authority ends." The order cracked through the stillness like lightning. The bailiff hesitated only for a second, then moved forward with quiet precision. The officers, suddenly stripped of their false power, shuffled toward the exit, their boots scuffing against the floor. One of them dared to mutter, "We didn't know." Her eyes followed them, cold but steady. "No. You didn't care to know." The doors closed behind them, and with their exit, the courtroom seemed to exhale. The tension lifted, replaced by a deeper, heavier respect. She turned back to the room, her tone softening, yet sharpening with truth. "This," she said, sweeping her gaze across lawyers, witnesses, and jurors alike, "is what happens when we allow prejudice to blind us. Justice is not a weapon. It is not a tool for humiliation. It is the measure by which society reveals its soul." The words hung in the air, unchallenged. Some nodded quietly. Others looked down in shame. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing history was unfolding right in front of them. She continued, voice steady but filled with conviction. "I stand here not to prove my worth. That was never in question. I stand to remind each of you why this courtroom exists, not for spectacle, not for ego, but for truth." The jurors leaned in, listening more intently than they had all day. Even the defense attorneys, once smirking behind their desks, now sat rigid, exposed under her gaze. She tapped the gavel once, not in anger, but in finality. This trial will proceed, and it will proceed without bias, without mockery, and without fear. And in that moment, the atmosphere shifted permanently. The courtroom was no longer a stage for arrogance or cruelty. It had become what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary for truth. For the first time that day, people sat straighter. The air felt cleaner. Even those who had doubted her could not deny the dignity she restored. As the first witness was called forward, she leaned back in her chair, the rightful seat she had reclaimed with poise, not rage. The humiliation they had forced upon her was not only erased, it had been transformed into a living lesson for all who watched. Poetic justice had been delivered. And though the trial itself was only beginning, Everyone in that room knew. The real verdict had already been given. The gavel's echo still lingered, but inside her chest, another sound beat louder, the steady rhythm of resilience. She sat at the bench, hands folded, posture unbroken. To the world it seemed like composure. To her, it was survival shaped into dignity. The courtroom had returned to order, but the memory of what had just unfolded refused to fade. She had been dragged, outed and dismissed. And now she sat not as a victim of that humiliation, but as its conqueror. She inhaled slowly, then let her voice rise, not in anger, but in reflection. Some of you will leave here today remembering a spectacle, but I ask you to remember the lesson instead. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, waiting for the right moment to speak. Her words carried beyond the walls. Reporters would repeat them, transcripts would capture them, and in time they would be quoted as something larger than the moment itself. She let her eyes drift across the faces in the room. The jurors still looked shaken, attorneys stiff, and even the gallery silent, hanging on her every word. When I walked in here this morning, I was not seen for who I am. I was measured against prejudice, weighed against assumption, and nearly silenced by ignorance. But let this day serve as proof. Appearances deceive. Justice, however, endures. The silence deepened. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the weight of truth pressing against every ear. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into a softer register. I do not speak this for myself. I have long known the cost of being underestimated. I speak it for every person who has been told they do not belong, every voice dismissed before it was heard, every life judged by its cover instead of its depth. For a moment, her gaze fell on the empty space where the officers had stood only minutes ago. A faint memory of their grip on her arms flickered through her. She steadied herself, not to erase it, but to claim it. They thought humiliation would diminish me. Instead, it revealed the truth. Authority is not granted by arrogance. It is earned by integrity. And integrity does not falter in the face of insult. The room seemed to breathe with her. A young law clerk in the corner wiped away a tear. An older attorney lowered his head, shame heavy on his shoulders. Even the jurors appeared transformed, as if their own hidden biases had been called out into the light. She tapped the gavel lightly, not to command silence, but to mark the words. Justice was tested today. It did not break. It did not bend. It endured. The rhythm of her voice turned softer now, almost like the final bars of a symphony. Remember this. The strength of our courts does not rest in titles, uniforms, or appearances. It rests in our courage to uphold what is right, even when the world insists we are wrong. That is what makes justice real. That is what gives it life. She allowed the words to settle. For the first time that day, she leaned back with the ease of someone who had not only survived the storm, but had claimed it as her own. A journalist in the gallery whispered, She didn't just win back her dignity, she redefined it. The truth was larger than whispers. This was no story of vengeance, no petty reversal of roles. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up to everyone who had doubted, reminding them that justice is not fragile. It is unshakable when rooted in truth. As the proceedings prepared to continue, her final words before moving forward became etched into memory. Humiliation can wound, but it cannot define. Power can be abused, but it cannot erase truth. And when truth stands, justice always finds its way home. The courtroom stirred, transformed, not just by her authority, but by her reminder that justice, though scarred by human weakness, can still rise above it. And with that, She lifted her gavel once more, ready to turn the page, not just on the trial, but on the story that would echo far beyond its walls.